Hello, hello. Anton's still figuring out where to sit. I didn't want another song to play because I'd have to wait till it's the end. What are you trying to figure out? Where to like plug your laptop in and stuff? Yeah. Like I think you can loop it around. Ooh, that's a pretty short cord.
Yeah, it is a short cord.
Here, hold on. Let's see.
It'll last. The battery will last. It's fine.
Okay.
I don't worry about it.
Okay.
Alrighty.
We're talking about the Arab world today, which is why we just played Lynyrd Skynyrd, which is one of the most beloved Arabic bands.
Yeah, the most topical music possible.
Son, I said, son, turn that Lynyrd Skynyrd up. All right. You think we're ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's get started.
All right. Welcome to. I think I was hashing out the show details with Anton in the Discord DMs. I think I was going to call it Science of History.
Yeah.
Something like that. Discursive, excursive Science of History. Excursive kind of makes it a little too pretentious.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
I don't know. Science of History is good for now. So in the automation, I'm going to write Science of History with Anton and Andy. Bam. And
Very
that's
cool.
The song we're logging. So today we are going to be discussing the Arab world, specifically the Arab Revolt, and the consequences preceding it. And then, of course, the figure that is inevitable when you talk about the Arab Revolt is
especially from a Western context. From a Western context, I think the Arab Revolt is very much seen through the lens of Lawrence because he was a Western person, right, who was involved in all these great events that happened. There's a great quote from the film, which I know Andy has not seen.
Yeah, I wanted to watch it tonight. I think I might watch it tomorrow. My boy Harry said he was too tired to watch it tonight.
Yeah, no worries. But you didn't do your research.
I read enough Wikipedia and I skimmed through Seven Pillars of Wisdom. It was a busy week.
I mean, I've read the book, I've seen the movie, so we should be covered. But there's a great quote from the film, and I'm not sure if it was actually said by the general in question, but there's a great quote that says, the British considered the Arab Revolt to be, they considered the Turks and the Ottomans, rather, to be a sideshow of World War I, right?
Yeah.
And then they considered Lawrence's and Faisal's revolt to be like a sideshow of a sideshow.
Yeah.
So I'm paraphrasing a little bit there. So it's definitely really interesting that Lawrence became such a cultural figure, and we'll get into why that is and how that happened and sort of why the Arab Revolt maybe didn't have the effects that the Arabs had hoped when it all got started out. But I think we'll start. We were talking about earlier. We'll start with discussing, what the Arab world looked like before World War I, because it looked really, really very different from what it looks like now. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the Ottoman system and how that worked out.
Yeah. So I'm not super hip with the Ottoman Empire, but first of all. So the first constitutional period was, I want to say it was Abdul Hamid, but maybe, no, Abdul Hamid was later. But anyways, there's this first constitutional system because the young Ottomans, precursor to the young Turks, think that the reforms that were kind of going on in the empire just weren't going far enough, right? I immediately think of our last week, we talked about Russia, of like 1905, right?
Right,
Like
the constitutional...
there's reforms, but it's slow, it's sluggish. We need a constitution, we need it now. And this was something that was actually interesting to me as a Westerner because I try to keep somewhat humble of my cultural my cultural empirics and what I'm actually able to understand, right? Because I'm not gonna the whole US trying to impose US ideals on countries that are completely foreign to that. That's preposterous, right? But when I saw this, it was really interesting because it's like at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, it seems like every country really had this constitutional push, even the ones that aren't Western at all.
Right.
The
Ottoman Empire, the common thing that we learn in school, the sick man of Europe, right? That's the common phrase used for the Ottoman Empire. And we have to remember that the Ottoman Empire was one of the world's largest imperial powers for a very, very long time. They were immensely strong. They controlled trade through the Black Sea. They controlled Constantinople from 1453 when they took it from Byzantium, which, of course, by World War I, Byzantium obviously long gone.
Yeah.
But from from Constantinople. They controlled Istanbul. Definitely, they had a very, very immense amount of power throughout the medieval period. By the time of World War I and by the time of like the 19th century, there had been a serious decline in the Ottomans' power.
Oh yeah.
They had lost territories. They were sort of on the way out as an imperial power for sure. And obviously the European powers recognized this, and Russia and Britain were very, very keen to exploit this. Now, I think we might mention real quick the Crimean War, right? The Crimean War was essentially an effort by the French and the British to stop the Russians from capitalizing on this. Yeah. This happened about maybe 50 years or so before World War I. It definitely sort of shows what the back and forth was like. Now, the European powers were not averse to working together. In World War I, obviously, they were working together. Specifically, not the Axis, but the
Central and the Allies.
But I think the Entente they called it.
Okay.
So by the time of World War I, and we're sort of going into the actual war now. So by World War I, they were very, very keen to work together, and we'll get into the Sykes-Picot Agreement in just a bit here, a little later, because it is very, very important, and it's specifically important because of the disillusionment of the Arabs with the European powers later on. But we'll get to that. But a lot of people don't know this, but one of the earlier versions of the Sykes-Picot Agreement actually involved Russia.
And that's why. So
it's very, very important. Interestingly, so if the Russian Revolution had not happened and Russia had not sort of withdrawn from the war to deal with its own problems, Russia was slated to receive a substantial chunk of the Dardanelles and Constantinople itself, which would have been a huge thing, especially considering the fact that the Russians obviously are Orthodox Christians and were, and I guess are still, but. So at that point, the Russians were an Orthodox power, and for them to have, had control over Constantinople, the location of the Hagia Sophia, would have been just a tremendous coup for them. But obviously that didn't happen, and Sykes-Picot became a more French-British sort of division of what we would call the Levant, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, etc. Obviously, by World War I, the British had interests in Egypt, substantial interests, Suez, etc., which actually played a really big part in the Arab Revolt, or at least it was sort of like a side event that happened there. But yeah, so definitely really, really interesting in terms of where the Ottomans were at that point and how they were being sort of targeted by the Entente, because they were a little far removed from Germany and Austria, so they couldn't really, they were sort of on their own, right?
I'll kind of abridge like all the way up to the Young Turks. The Young Ottomans happen. There's a constitution, and then they take it away. More years of conservative rule under Abdul Hamid. Then the Young Turks happen, and bam, we're back at like second constitutional period. And the Young Turks take over parliament, and we have in kind of the twilight years of the Ottoman this parliamentary democracy, which ended up, heavily favored the CUP, which is I want to say the committee for, I don't know. I was literally looking this up beforehand, but the CUP was like the Young Turks like vanguard party turned into I was trying to think of like the Latin bridge to sound smart. Is it cum? Whatever. They're like the Revolutionary Vanguard Party becoming the like parliamentary party that's overseeing this great resurgence in the empire. But they slowly kind of become disillusioned with these, they were certainly materialists and positivists. They were very, kind of had this like optimistic, secular, democratic worldview, but eventually the CUP becomes to be more and more dominated by either converts to this ideology or just raw numbers of this ideology, more of a Turkish nationalism. And the it's kind of like we're going to bring the Ottoman Empire under this great Turkish rule for the Turkish people, because they see this like pan-Arabism or this pan-Ottomanism is just, it's not going to work out. There's too much here. And this kind of gives the king of Hejaz, the custodian of the mosques at this point, who is, it's Hussein, right?
Custodian of Mecca.
Custodian of Mecca?
I believe so, yeah.
I thought he was custodian of both mosques, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, well, I think we can get into Arab nationalism at this point, because it's a really, really important part about the Arab Revolt. That the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Turks, right? So the Turkish people filled all of the power structures, including in the constitutional period that Andy was just talking about. There was a huge misrepresentation or underrepresentation of Arab interests in the Ottoman Empire, and that was a big deal because a lot of the territory of the Ottoman Empire outside of Anatolia and Constantinople, those areas, were Arabs. They spoke Arabic. They were nationally Arabs. They still maintained their old ancient tribal tradition that they had kept for at that point thousands of years. So there was definitely an impetus for change, and the whole Arab Revolt essentially was fomenting for quite a long time before this. I mean, the Ottomans had exercised sovereignty over the Arab lands in Arabia since like the early 16th century, I want to say. So it was a big deal. They maintained a presence in the Islamic holy cities. Obviously, the Turks are Muslim as well. They use the Arabic script.
Yeah.
Or they used to. Now the Latin script is used. But yeah, anyway. So to get into the beginning of the revolt, right? We have to talk about this fellow Sharif, and who was, as Andy said, he was the sort of the monarch of the Jordanian, what is now Jordan, and actually his family still controls Jordan. I was actually surprised to learn this. So he is the Sharif. Is actually part of the Hashemite clan of which the Prophet Muhammad is descended, right? So he's kind of like Muslim royalty. Obviously, between different sects of Islam, there's differing kinds of views on this, but I would say all generally place the Hashemites at some level of respect, right? This is the clan that Muhammad is descended from, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he himself was like a 36th generation direct descendant of Muhammad. Right, but there's a lot of families that do claim descent, right? Because the caliphate, or the whole idea of the caliphate, is, and we're not going to get too far into this because we're not Muslim, we can't really, we don't have any kind of experience here, but definitely. Definitely a very respected figure, especially among the Arabs.
And he was the custodian of Mecca at this point. He was he basically had this casus belli, this cause for war, as the CUP, this Young Turk Democratic Assembly. They're just going totally Turkish. They're leaving us Arabs out, and with their whole Turkish secular plan, they are completely stripping the Ottomans of the authority of the caliphate, right? Because the Ottomans did claim some authority of like the caliphate,
right? And that's interesting because in order to claim that authority, you have to be descended from Muhammad. And obviously, they were Turks. Kind of there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Now, I think we can start talking about the Arab Revolt now because. It was declared in Mecca, right? It was declared by the Sharif in Mecca, and his sons, importantly Faisal. So Faisal is a very important figure in the Arab Revolt. So we'll be talking about him a little bit more a little later. So they proclaimed the Arab Revolt, I think in 1916.
October 1916, or June 1916.
Yeah, June. So he proclaimed the revolt on the 10th of June in Mecca, and immediately, and actually really even before then, there was an attack on Medina, which is the second holy city of Islam. As some of our listeners might be aware. Now, the attack on Medina failed. And it was not successful. The Turks had something like a 12,000 strong garrison in Medina, and the Arabs, being essentially opportunistic fighters at that point, and actually throughout the entire revolt, they were much better on the ground. Like moving around, sort of opportunistic warfare, as we would call it.
Yeah.
So they were not really very good at taking cities, especially large cities with large garrisons. So Medina was a failure. And actually, the Ottomans were able to not only break the siege, but pursue the rebels out into the desert, which was not a great start to the rebellion. But they did have some limited success, even early on. There's a lot of rebel clans that were able to take cities like the ports were very, very susceptible, and they took a couple ports, and it's important as well. We didn't really mention this, but the British were definitely taking advantage of this, because at that point, the war has sort of become inevitable, or even started at that point, and the British are very keen to capitalize on this fact. Obviously we know about Gallipoli, right? That was their main sort of push against the Ottoman Turks a little later on, but they definitely saw this Arab revolt as an opportunity to sort of distract the Turks. Yeah. So they definitely worked very closely with them quite soon. And actually, the Arab ports that were taken, or the ports that were taken by the Arabs, rather, I should say, were used by the British to support their naval power in the region.
Yeah. And if I can butt in real quick before we leave this figure of Sharif, and I want to talk about Mecca real quick. Is Sharif says, like, the Ottomans are like desecrating, they're losing the authority of the caliphate, and so it's time for like the Arabs to like rise up and like basically come together and defeat the Ottomans, because they're just not in religious interests anymore. And so the rebellion starts. There's this revolt in Mecca, and there's a lot more Arab soldiers than Ottoman soldiers, but the Ottoman soldiers are just way more well equipped, and it's tremendously bloody. It doesn't go well for them. And then the British come in and reinforce them and eventually drive the Ottomans out. And so this is kind of the first, I think the British had troops in Egypt, I believe.
Yes, so the British High Command was in Egypt at that point.
Yeah.
Now, Egypt was essentially under British control at that point. That goes back to Kitchener and Gordon and all those guys, the Khartoum, and all those great battles that happened there, in which actually Churchill was involved, but we'll get to that later. We'll get to that some other time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in 1916, the British send a mission essentially to the Arabs, and that's actually when Lawrence of Arabia comes into the picture, because he was part of that. T.E. Lawrence was his name, and he is a really interesting figure, and I think that we'll probably focus a lot on him for this podcast or this show, because like we said before, a lot of the Western sort of view of this revolt is centered around the personality of this one fellow. And so a little bit about T.E. Lawrence, just to sort of give a little background. He was not an army man. He was not a what we would call a career soldier or anything like that. Lawrence of Arabia was essentially an archaeologist who was, I believe he was. He went to one of the Oxbridge schools, and I think Cambridge he went to. But he worked extensively in the Levant. He learned Arabic. He was doing a lot of excavations there. And by the time the war started, or the war was sort of already brewing, the British realized that they needed people on the ground, and they needed people who could sort of spy on Ottoman railways and things like that. And Lawrence of Arabia was perfectly, and we're going to call him Lawrence of Arabia here because that's his moniker. At that point, he was just T.E. Lawrence. But he was perfectly placed. He spoke Arabic. He knew the land. He knew the people, and he was perfectly placed to spy on railway, movements of the Ottoman Turks, and especially they were interested in how much, the stuff that the Ottomans were sending south, because they were quite concerned, especially in the early days, about an attack on Suez and their interest in Egypt, right? So T.E. Lawrence essentially started out as a spy for the British, observing those movements. Later on, obviously, he became involved with Faisal and the leaders of the Arab Revolt. At the time that he got involved with them, when he was sent on this mission, he was the Arab Revolt was in terrible shape. It was sort of coming apart at the seams. They were losing people. The Arab tribes were sort of bound to clan leaders, and not all of them were as enthused, I suppose, with the leadership of the Hashemites. And they were, at the time that he joined the cause, there was a lot of defection that was going on.
Yeah.
So Faisal took this fellow Lawrence as his advisor, and they began to change up their strategy a little bit, and they started to attack railways and less fortified areas, and they saw immense success there.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where the legend of Lawrence of Arabia started, right? He started to wear Arab dress. He looks sick as hell.
like those photos of Lawrence in Arabia, just like this like obviously British white dude wearing the Arab drag.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So
I mean, he definitely had that Arab drip going on.
Yeah.
Which was, nowadays it's like, people who see that, they're like, oh, cultural appropriation and all of that.
Yeah, no.
But he was very much, I don't want to say he was fully accepted by the Arabs, because I can't really speak to that. I can't say that they really, I think, a lot of people have said that they accepted him as one of their own, and perhaps that's true, but that, you would have to ask, the Arabs what their opinion is about that.
Whatever you would define as that, but I think it's obvious that they trusted him and they saw him as, he was a Westerner that they put a great deal of responsibility in, and that at least their actions speak to some level of trust and integration at that point.
Right.
That's all you can say, really, because anybody that can speak to the sentiments towards Arabia is now long dead, right? I mean,
they had their own name for Lawrence. They called him El Lorenz because the Arabic language doesn't really it doesn't really lend itself really well to the pronunciation of Lawrence. Yeah. They called him El Lorenz, and so he was very much in actually a lot of the British high command maybe even considered Lawrence to have gone native, as they say. It was a real heart of darkness stuff, because and there's a lot of debate about that, because Lawrence of Arabia was never an Arab. He was he was always a British officer, because they did actually, he became an officer when they started to use his services. So he was always a British officer, and that sort of, again, like when we talk a little later about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and Arab betrayal of the Arabs by the Western powers. There's a big question of whether or not, first of all, whether Lawrence knew the British weren't going to honor their agreements, and second of all, whether or not this is a betrayal of the Arabs by Lawrence, or where that stands. Yeah. And I think it's really important to recognize that Lawrence was, like I said, he was always a British officer. He was always reporting to the British High Command.
Yeah.
So ultimately, and Lawrence was not very happy by the betrayal of the Arabs, but he was not really, he wasn't going to,
go back
and betray the British interests as well. Now there's some talk about the taking of Damascus, and how Lawrence was very, very keen to push for the Arabs to be the first into Damascus. Incidentally, they were not the first into Damascus. I think the Australians got there first, but yeah, we'll get to that a little later, I think. So there's a couple of anecdotes about Lawrence's time fighting with the Arabs, which I think are really sort of telling. The first one is the Battle of Aqaba. Now, I don't know if you got to read about this at all, Andy, but
like a bit. I went past the section in the book. I read a few pages on it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the Battle of Aqaba is really kind of interesting, because in the film and in portrayals of Lawrence, it's sort of shown as this sort of Lawrence-led expedition, and it's a big deal. So Aqaba is this port on the Red Sea. It's at the very, very southern or northern tip of the Red Sea. So it's right there at where the Red Sea sort of terminates in a corner. Now that area is controlled by Jordan, and actually Israel has a port city right next to Aqaba called Eilat. And I've been to that area.
Really?
And it's really quite interesting because you can, when you're in Eilat, the Eilat, whatever you want to, however you want to pronounce it, you can literally look over the border and see Aqaba. Sort of on the Jordanian side.
Wild.
It's very, very cool. But the sort of the idea, the concept of the Battle of Aqaba is interesting because in order to attack Aqaba was lightly defended from the landward side because north of that area there's a really huge erg or desert as that's the Arabic word for it. It's called Al Nafud, and it is an extremely dry and terrible place to be.
Yeah.
So the landward side was badly defended because the Ottomans never really considered the idea that somebody would be crazy enough or even capable to cross this immense desert. So the Arabs were commanded by a guy named Auda Ibu Tayyi, and so please forgive my Arabic pronunciation. I don't really speak it, but they under Lawrence's suggestion, they crossed the Al Nafud Desert and they attacked it from the landward side. And now the British had been trying to take Aqaba for a long time from the sea, but the guns that were emplaced in Aqaba were very, very they were really well defended from the sea. So the British hadn't been able to really attack them. But so with this landward attack by the Arabs, they were able to take Aqaba with British support, and that was like one of the biggest early on victories for Lawrence and the Arabs, and that was when I think the British command, and it's been said that the British command really started to take it seriously.
Yeah.
They started to realize that the Arabs were able to really make a difference in this area. So that's a really important little episode. Now, there's another episode in this the war, the massacre at Tafas.
Yes,
which is I know you've read a little bit about. So if you want to introduce that real quick,
I would probably let you take the reels. It's more just about. Like Lawrence talks about it in his book, and he was like, I think the phrase he uses, he was mad with killing. Like he and the Arabs were mad with killing.
Right.
Which is kind of just as a larger thing. This is like the thing about war is like, you like get pissed off and you tell someone to screw off or something. And like the consequences of that is that like someone's like mad at you for like a bit. Like in war, if you get like really pissed off, like you just like massacre a populace, and obviously this was like a reaction to earlier massacres, right? But
right. Well, it's important to note. This is a really kind of a controversial topic, and I don't think that we can really judge or condemn or condone. But there is so Tafas is a town in the southwest area of the very southwest edge of what is now Syria. So it's like it borders Jordan. It's very, very close. And the reason why the whole massacre happened was because the Arabs and Lawrence had found a previous massacre by the Turks, who had killed a whole slew of villages, just like women, children, everything.
Yeah.
And that's why they were so upset. Now, the interesting thing about Tafas is that there was the first time that Lawrence gave the order not to take prisoners.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal because before then they were very, they sort of obeyed the laws of warfare more or less. But Tafas was a huge battle in which the Arabs killed every Ottoman they could find.
Yeah.
There was actually 250 German and Austrian troops actually with them who also were gunned down. Yeah. With no really including people who had surrendered, they killed. So that's a very interesting thing, and Lawrence talks about it in his book, like you said. And I think in the film and in other portrayals of Lawrence, it sort of shows that Lawrence is this got really, really very mad, like you said, mad with war, mad with killing. Yeah. Lawrence, I think, to my view, I think Lawrence was much more methodical than that.
You think so?
I think so. I think he was very cold and calculated with that action. I think that he was, he was one of the early displays of what we would call PTSD. Obviously, after World War I, shell shock and all that stuff, that we started really talking about that as a society. But he was definitely shell shocked. I don't think he enjoyed killing. There's a great anecdote about him where he was forced to kill a man who was a traitor. And he killed him, and then he went out in the desert. And when they found him, he was huddled behind a rock with his head in his hands.
Yeah,
you know. So he was not a guy who was really
fond.
He was not some kind of like killing machine. He was really not into all of that. It was sort of more by necessity, I think. So yeah, Tafas is another really big sort of moment in that whole war. And then, of course, Damascus. We can talk about Damascus a little bit, and then that'll lead into the Sykes-Picot stuff.
Yeah.
So Damascus,
fourth holy city, for those of you keeping track at home.
Where's Istanbul on that list?
I would imagine it's like, I don't know, 5 or 6. Because 1, 2, 3 is Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem.
Yes. Yeah.
And then 4, like those are all 3, like all Islam agrees on that. 4 is a little dodgy, but it's generally considered Damascus.
Yeah.
Maybe Istanbul's like 5 or 6. I don't know.
Right. Because Damascus was Salahadin's capital, among other great Muslim leaders in the past. Salahadin, incidentally, was a Kurd. So, and he was the Sultan of Egypt. So keep track of that. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of movements in the Arab world where different areas are like in power and then not in power. But anyway, so to get back to Damascus, essentially the British were moving north along the shore, along the coast of the Mediterranean, and the Arabs were attacking north through the interior, as we'd say, because they were definitely better suited to desert warfare. And it was kind of two flanks of this attack. Now, Lawrence was quite keen to have the Arabs take Damascus first. And this was important because Damascus, the British had sort of obliquely promised the Arabs self-rule and self-determination after the war. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's important to sort of notice that. So that's where we start to look at, the betrayal of the Arabs by the Western powers. Now, so the taking of Damascus, so the Arabs did not get to Damascus first. That's a common misconception. A lot of people say that they did. They did not. The British Expeditionary Forces, I believe it was the Australians got there first and sort of cleared the way, and then the Arabs move in. There's this huge symbolic victory at Damascus. So after that, Lawrence essentially goes home. He goes back to Britain, and then we get into the whole Sykes-Picot stuff. So Sykes-Picot was an agreement, like I said, like we were talking about earlier, it was an agreement by the Western powers about how to divide the Levant into spheres of influence.
Yes, and I want all listeners to imagine. So I want all listeners to imagine that between the Sharif and the British diplomat, I forget his specific name. I know there's a name for everything. Basically, yes, the Arabs are promised self-rule, whatever that might mean, because the borders were obviously famously highly disputed by both parties, right? Because the Sharif said he was, the custodian and caliph of all Arabia,
the king of all Arabs.
Which none of the allies recognized, and they're like, the British are like, sure, and I want you to like close your eyes and imagine two people just like mischievously shaking their hands together, like, yes, we'll give you the Levant.
Exactly. So, and it's so super complex. It's a complex question, whether or not, because I think that the promises that the British made were oblique. They were not. They were probably purposely oblique because obviously the British were not, they wanted more land.
They're good. If there's one thing the British are good at, it's imperialism. They knew how to do it.
Exactly. And, a lot of the modern borders of the Arab lands were drawn essentially by this
agreement between, there was other countries involved, but generally we think of it as Britain and France.
Right.
Seeing who gets what. And there's a great little bit of Fry and Laurie skit about this. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, but I know Fry and Laurie.
Yeah. It's like this British sketch show where it's Sykes and it's like these two unnamed World War I diplomats, and they're all like doing this very intricate partitioning of all the lands, after World War I, what's going to happen to Germany. Very intricate, very well thought out. I was like, oh, I'm getting hungry. I guess it's time to wrap up. And then they leave their seats and someone's like, well, what about the Middle East? And they're like, oh, yeah. Then they just like mindlessly jot a bunch of
line. Right?
Yeah. So, and that's the funniest, that little punchline is the funniest thing. And it's very descriptive of what the Sykes-Picot was. It was literally like, this is my side, this is your side. Complete disregard of any, ethnic or religious boundaries, which of course famously led to
very serious problems.
Yes,
later on.
Yes.
And maybe we'll talk about that towards the end. About like what effect this actually had on the Arab world, because it was substantial, right? So the Sykes-Picot essentially created there's an A zone and a B zone, which were under French and British influence.
Literally marked as A and B on the map.
Yes.
They signed a map and it's literally marked A and B. It's comical. Yeah.
So the B zone included Jordan. It included parts of Arabia, and then there was direct. So this is British influence technically, but obviously they controlled the area. And then sort of east of there, Baghdad, those areas, all the way to the Persian Gulf, that was actually controlled directly by Britain. Now France got north of that sort of diagonal line. And that diagonal line still exists, by the way. If you ever look at the border of Syria, you will see that the border of Syria is pretty much right on that line. Yeah. So Damascus fell into the French zone, as well as parts of Turkey, which were later, during the Turkish
War of Independence.
Were obviously taken back. Now, Lawrence was not pleased with this, it should be noted. It was very much against this whole business. And he actually, I think he wrote to Parliament, and he might have even spoken to Parliament about this regarding, hey, this is not going to go very well if we treat our allies like this.
Yeah. It's a total lack of any diplomatic integrity. I mean, not that if any guys ever play the board game, it's a World War I themed board game, Diplomacy. Diplomatic integrity is a bit of a misnomer, but complete lack of diplomatic integrity, complete lack of knowledge for the lands, which obviously Lawrence recognized. And actually, interestingly, kind of later on after he had died, there was this whole reevaluation of Lawrence's legacy, because he was a bit of a British national hero.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of, I don't want to say besmirching, because obviously I think he did some pretty, at least questionable, debatable things, right? Mm-hmm. But there is this kind of a smear campaign against him, which was very notably led by a famed British imperialist. And because Lawrence was very much for... obviously, like you said, he didn't go in and join, but Lawrence was definitely preferred Arabic self-determination.
Right.
And the whole smear against Lawrence's legacy. I'm trying to think of like a less charged, a less polemic word, but than smeared. But that's what I can best think of it.
Right, and I think that's absolutely a good word for it.
That was led by people that
it's politically inconvenient to be, to look at it the way that Lawrence looked at it. Now, Lawrence died in a motorcycle crash. Not so long.
He was pretty young too. He was like 43, 46, something like that.
Yeah.
He was very young I think that's another thing to look at in this Lawrence of Arabia saga is he was in his 20s, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure he was in his late 20s, early 30s for all this, which is that's a pretty early time to be leading a whole nationalist revolt, but Yeah. Back to the Sykes-Picot or whatever you were trying to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Sykes-Picot agreement was definitely a huge thing. The betrayal of the Arabs, as we were talking about. And there were other British people who recognized that this was going to be a problem. And especially, this is a thorny topic, but there was an international zone around Jerusalem all the way up north to Haifa, which if you ever look at a map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you will recognize it as essentially Israel-Palestine, right? It's that area. And that's really where the trouble started with that area, because the British mandate in Palestine led into all the issues with Israel that happened, slightly later on. Like obviously that's sort of a different topic that I don't know if we want to cover here. Probably not.
Well, I can tell a funny story. Can you let me tell an anecdote?
Go.
So I worked at GM this past summer, and my boss, his name was Hussein. He was a Lebanese Sunni Muslim, great dude. He was just a wonderful guy. We got along really well, except for the last day in work when I let that kind of paradox game player in me take hold, and I said Napoleon was awesome, and he got really pissed off at me, which he was right. I mean, that's kind of a
well, because Napoleon did a lot of stuff in that area.
Yeah.
And it was not exactly his best work. Let's say.
But I mean, we could. I think he understood. It was just like dumbass white boy stuff. But. He was going to Lebanon, and he was showing me like where he was going, like the Lebanese area, just like the Levant in general. And he kept pointing at on the map labeled Israel, and he'd be like Palestine. He just could not call. He would not call. He refused to, and it was so fun. I mean, I don't really care. It was so funny to me. And then like. I remember one day he was like, and these people, they are moving to Palestine, and they say they're native, but they sunburn, that's like burned in my mind as the funniest. That's funny. I think that's like a common, and I've seen that around. I think that's like a common. This is an aside, but that's like a common thing for people. Are very pro-Palestine. They're saying like these people that moved to Israel sunburn. It's like they're non-native. It's a funny anecdote, not related. But
and of course, with that whole situation, I think that we would need, first of all, it is a thorny topic. There's a lot of different opinions on it, very strongly held. And it's quite. It's a minefield. Let's put it that way. So I don't know how much into that.
Yeah, that's what happens when you have the three Abrahamic religions in one area, city. Right? One area.
Exactly. And I've been through that area. I want
to go to the Alabama Roll Tide shirt in Jerusalem.
Very American of you.
I really want to.
But I mean. So Lawrence was, I looked this up because I wasn't sure. He was 46 when he died. He died in a motorcycle crash in 1935. This was substantially after the war. And I think that he was very disillusioned. I think that, what we didn't really mention when we said that he was supporting, there was a Paris Peace Conference, it was the end of, World War I. And he went to that in Arab dress.
Oh, really?
Which scandalized a lot of people. And he did it because he was very, very, like we've discussed, he was very, very keen on lobbying for Arab independence.
And the Sharif was also at the Paris Peace Accords and was famously not very happy with them either.
No. Well, and of course, like in that, I mean, who would be, right? And he... by the time he died, I think he had already become a legend. And a lot of that actually came there. I think there was an American photographer who was sort of responsible for the legendization of Lawrence, because he was the one who took all those pictures, or most of those pictures of him, on camels and in Arab dress and all of that. And there was like tours in America where it was like, oh wow, look at this guy.
He was a very reluctant book tourer. He really didn't want to, but he sold more copies that way.
Exactly. So Lawrence, obviously he wrote 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which I strongly recommend that the listeners.
He's a great writer,
check out, because it is a very, very interesting and it's a snapshot of history from the eyes of a more Western perspective, which I think is helpful for
us Westoids.
For the Westerners. And I think that importantly, he is not a judgmental writer, and a lot of the material from that time comes from British writers or et cetera, that are biased. And he was probably the closest thing to an unbiased Western source that you can really find. So definitely, if you have the time, definitely check it out. It's a great book. There's 2 versions. There's an abridged version, which isn't hard to read, and I think even the full version isn't that long.
So I got this version from the library. It's totally in tatters, but the cover is this little Arabic art, which is really cool.
Does it have the sword on it?
Yeah.
So that's like one of the original prints.
I believe it's an original print because it has this little like serrate. I can't think of like all the pages are like different lengths, I love that. But
very cool. So once Andy turns that in, please check it out.
I'll probably turn it in sometime next week. I'm gonna skim it some more. I'm going. I'm not going to talk my reading list on air, but in it, it's 600 pages or so, but it's written in narrative style, very terse, pretty terse prose, pretty digestible. The version that I have has a lot of pictures in it, which is nice. It has a lot of drawings and pictures in it. It's pretty large print, so I would imagine
very cool.
I would imagine in terms of like regular nonfiction, it's equivalent to like a 350-page nonfiction book, depending on your average history nonfiction book. It depends on like what you find like easier to read than others. Right now I'm reading like Critique of Pure Reason. It's like 10 pages an hour. It's a drag. Yeah. That book, I'm like, ooh, just did 60 pages in a sitting. This is nice.
So, and if you don't have time to read the book, there is also a great film.
People love this movie.
Yes, it's one of the classics of cinema, Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, with Peter O'Toole. It's an excellent film. There are some inaccuracies, but for the most part,
British cinema. You got to give them throw them a bone. Yeah.
But frankly, I think that as far as historical accuracy goes, it's pretty good. It's in fact very good, I think. There's some, I would take some issues with the casting. I think first of all, casting Alec Guinness as Faisal. Maybe Alec Guinness, for those who maybe recognize the name, he played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars trilogy. He's a British man. He was cast as the Arab king Faisal. Of course, like back then, there was not really a lot of consideration about casting. Actual Arabs in those parts. He does a great job, incidentally. Like it doesn't. I don't think it detracts from the quality of the film, but definitely that's something that probably should be noted in today's. And
then I think like the one like big Middle Eastern guy they got was like Omar Sharif, which is who they got for like whenever they needed a middle. It was like Peter Lorre whenever they wanted like a shifty foreigner in like the 30s and 40s, you know.
So, but all in all, a great film. The other issue I take with the casting is they cast Peter O'Toole as Lawrence. Now, Peter O'Toole does an a fantastic job, a really, really great job. However, Peter O'Toole is like 6'1", and Lawrence of Arabia was like 5'6".
Really?
Yeah. Lawrence of Arabia was a tiny guy.
Wow.
Actually, let me look that up because I don't want to.
Yeah, you don't want to hype mog Lawrence of Arabia on air.
I want to make sure that he was 5'5".
5'5". Oh, so he was short.
He was a very small fellow, and he was, by all accounts, fairly effeminate. Which completely, a lot of people, will, when they think of Lawrence of Arabia, think of this like tough, like dude.
Oh, I think of the poster. He's on a horse.
Yeah, he's on a horse. He has all these very masculine sort of cultural perceptions, but he himself was not that. He was very introspective. He did not fulfill the sort of cultural stereotype of this like manly man. And I think that's
certainly for a leader of a revolt.
Right. And, that's not even getting into the stuff, like there is an episode that we didn't really talk about, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about it, but I'll mention it because there was an incident in Daraa, which was when Lawrence was actually captured by the Ottomans for a period. And he was... in his book, he describes that, he was tortured and he was actually sexually assaulted. I don't know if we can discuss that on air.
You can. It's not.
Okay. So he was sexually assaulted, and there's debate among historical historians whether or not that actually happened or if that is a sort of a fantasy of Lawrence's. And this is true. It's
I know. It's just crazy.
It is a controversial historical topic. But it should be mentioned that some people do think that he was a homosexual. And obviously at that time it was not accepted. It was not something you talked about openly. But there's some writings by him, some poetry that maybe suggests that way. In fact, I think that in some versions of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, there's a little poem at the very beginning that is quite possibly addressed to a man. And it's a lovely poem, so definitely read it.
Did he marry before he died?
I don't believe so. Okay. I think he was a lifelong bachelor. Okay. And so that's another sort of indication that he may have been homosexual. So that's a very interesting thing.
It's funny. Let us not dwell on it.
Let's because I don't think it is an important part of the story of Lawrence of Arabia. But I definitely think it should be noted.
It's interesting.
And, that it should be noted, as well, that he wasn't really this stereotypical masculine macho guy. And I think it's really important. And I think that in terms of Lawrence's whole legacy, that should be taken into account. That he was very likely a representative of the LGBTQ community. Right.
That is really interesting what you say, though, because have you read I think it's The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon?
No.
So Algerian War of Independence guy. Mm-hmm. One of the greatest, I think it's probably the greatest first person account of what actually colonialism actually is. Mm. And it's kind of it's interesting because we think of at least in Western culture, how we depict colonialism is just stupid, like the Avatar movies. Did you see the new one?
No, I haven't seen the second one. No.
Have you seen the first one?
I've seen the first one.
It's this whole beautiful Mother Gaia people, and then the big bad U.S. military who's ultra masculine, castrative father comes in and cuts off this Freudian mother, whatever.
Okay. Yeah, that's film. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. But and it's this is that's how people view American or European imperialism is these displacing these natives through this sheer brute masculinity of the European natives. And Frantz Fanon, who was a subject of, I believe, French rule in Algeria and fought in the Algerian War of Independence, actually characterizes the French, the Europeans, as very effeminate, and actually as the Algerian fighters as these raw masculine. This is his words. This isn't me just doing weird. I mean, okay, maybe I was going a little Freudian on the Avatar analysis, but Fanon has this says these natives are this raw, violent, masculine force that are just subjugated by these more effeminate Europeans that just have these environmental advantages. And it's tapping into that violence is what allowed him to overcome this war of independence, which is why it's interesting for me to hear that the leader, at least of the European side of the Arab Revolt, was characterized as particularly an effeminate guy.
And I think it's important with the Algerians and with the Arabs to consider that masculine and feminine roles in Arabic society are not the same as they are in European sort of milieu. They're different, and I think that should be recognized. But it's definitely an interesting part of Lawrence's legacy, and I think that it has not been discussed as much as it should be. And I think that in the future, especially with current cultural sort of direction, I think that it will be, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, the one thing that I would take I would kind of raise a point is at what point are you doing psychohistory, psychobiography, which is I read a great book by Erik Erikson called Young Man Luther, which is kind of a little psychobiography of Martin Luther. Its conclusions may be spotty because one, psychoanalysis is kind of a goofy science in the first place, but
and historical psychoanalysis is even more.
It's how can you determine anything, right? But
I think there's a risk of that, obviously.
And there's one that they did of there's a psychobiography of Thomas Jefferson that people say is great. I'm untrustworthy of such obscure information, our empirical ability to recover and
how much can you really tell about a person by their writings and the writings of people around them, right?
And that's another thing. But then again, there's that scene, and this is a fictional one, but this stuff has been at least latent in society, especially, you have Frederick the Great famously was a champion of the Weimars, but that scene in Brothers Karamazov, which you've read, right? Yes, that scene, oh man, I'm forgetting the names, but it is who's this? I'm having trouble with the Russian name. Who's the sensuous brother?
I can't remember.
Alexei.
It has been a while.
It's Alexei. But basically, Alexei promises his undying love to two different women, and then the two women get together. And the scene where they're together is this is Dostoevsky has to be explicitly writing this to have this undertone. I brought this up to my buddy Calvin, and Calvin accused me. Calvin's probably listening, by the way. I love you, Calvin.
Hello, Calvin.
He accused me of doing 21st century lit professor analysis, and I'm are you crazy? Read this. If this book was if this book was written today people would say this is explicitly like homoerotic subtext.
Right. Yes,
it's written
yes.
in older times,
Right.
but like,
No, I
it's
think,
not like it didn't exist.
I think that's very, very important. You know, a lot of people that, you know, are pundits now would, they see this like phenomenon of you know, this sort of sexual liberation as a new thing. It was absolutely not. You know, codified in law, yes, obviously at Lawrence's time and you know, before Oscar Wilde, for instance, you know, was put in prison for homosexual activity. But people were writing about it and people were thinking about it for essentially all of human history. That's really very important to note. I will say a couple more things about Lawrence because I think it's important. There's a couple little factoids. First of all, this is sort of getting off of the whole, you know, his sexuality, and I think that's fine. We can move on. So Lawrence actually never had any battlefield training. He was never a soldier. I think I mentioned that earlier. He didn't.
He's a great strategist.
He was amazing at it. He was exceptional at it. But he never had any kind of military involvement prior to the Arab Revolt, and then afterwards when he went back to Britain, he changed his name a couple times because he was not super into the fame thing, and he re-enlisted in the RAF.
Really?
Which is something that is sort of like a footnote in Lawrence's life. I think a lot of things are footnotes in Lawrence's life that happened after the Arab Revolt, which you know it's understandable, but it is you know, it gives us an incomplete view of his life. The other thing is he was actually summoned by King George in 1918, and Lawrence went for like a private audience because he at that point was fairly well known. He went there and he wanted to talk about Arab independence like he always did. He was very, like we've talked about, he was very committed to this cause. But the king instead offered him a knighthood, which he refused. So he refused a knighthood based on the idea that the British had betrayed the Arabs and on reneging the promise. And he just told the monarch at the time, George, he said, I won't take it. And he left. And that was it. There's not a lot of people that would refuse a knighthood for political.
I mean, not like the Beatles get knighthoods.
Right. Well, that came later. Let's be fair.
I'm just being silly.
No, but you know what I mean. Like, it was very much. He refused the knighthood, and he was doing it for his own moral convictions.
Man of principles, for sure.
Oh yeah, very much so. And I think that's a very, very important thing, and it sort of gives insight into his philosophy. Now, another thing that I think is important to note with Lawrence of Arabia in general and his legacy is, you know, there's this trope of the white savior, right? It's interesting that you talked about Avatar earlier because a lot of people talk about that film in that context because there's a guy who goes from this Western context, and he goes goes native, as we would say, and he leads these native people to, and you know, there's a lot of films like this. Dances with Wolves, Last Samurai, you know, and so different. Personally, I think that Last Samurai is not really that because I think
actually, if I'm not mistaken, I actually believe that a lot of Japanese people actually like The Last Samurai.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't speak to that because that's one of those things.
I have a few buddies that were in Japan for like a month.
Okay,
so
So that's a primary source there.
Good.
But
hey, white boy history.
I think so. My personal take on Last Samurai, I think that film is you know, Tom Cruise's character, whatever his name is, I forget, but in that film. He's more of an observer, of this time. And obviously, Last Samurai, it should be noted, is highly fictional. It's based on a real guy, but the real sort of samurai revolt didn't really happen the way it did. Anyway, the point is that, you know, he was an observer there. And I definitely think that Lawrence of Arabia is an interesting person because it's a historical event where a Western person goes into this sort of non-Western context, and he sort of leads this, ends up being a leader of this movement. And, but I think that importantly, I think Lawrence would never consider himself a savior.
No.
He would never consider himself a, I don't think Lawrence would even consider himself a leader or a very important figure in this revolt.
Yeah.
Lawrence was not the man.
He's pretty humble.
And that's another reason why even in now when we're thinking about these problems and we're thinking about these sort of cultural sort of questions where we're looking at like imperialist Western powers and things like that. I think that it holds up. The book holds up very, very well because Lawrence was very respectful of the Arab cause, and he was very aware of the fact that he was just an observer. In whatever we could say. I personally think that he had a great effect on it. I think that his liaison with the British essentially ensured the success of the revolt, which was struggling before he got involved. But I don't think he would have ever said that. I don't think he was that guy. So really interesting sort of, and definitely if the listeners end up reading the book, think about that. And consider the white savior trope.
And again, secondary book recommendation that I used to analyze Avatar is Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. First person account of colonialism. Awesome. It's a great book. Great book. Great book.
So I've actually heard about it. I've not read it, but I have read this. It's very good. But yeah, so anything else you'd like to add about Lawrence or?
Yeah, maybe we cover the Turks another time. That's kind of like I
mean, the whole history of the Ottoman Empire is really interesting.
It is interesting. And I'm glad we did this little bit on it, because when you said like the Arabian Revolt and Lawrence of Arabia, I was like, I know nothing about this. Like that was like a research week for me.
So in case the listeners are wondering why perhaps our sources are a little sparse or one-sided, it's because I suggested this to Andy maybe half a week ago or something like that.
I think it was at Wednesday when I was in my electronics class.
So it was not a very, but I'm personally very passionate about Lawrence of Arabia. I think he's a really interesting figure, and I'm glad we got to talk about him, even if it wasn't perhaps as informative. I think really, hopefully, listeners who their interest might be piqued by our conversations here today would actually read the primary source. That's my hope. But definitely glad that we could do this.
And a couple of closing thoughts of just mine is this was an interesting one for me to tackle because I just know nothing about like the Arab world and the Ottoman world, the Turkish world. And I realized after this that I should definitely say the Arab world and the Turkish world distinctly.
Yep, totally.
Because, but it is kind of interesting to look at it from a Western perspective. I think Lawrence is like kind of like the perfect like mediator or mediatrix for this kind of thing, because like I have like a few books on the Islamic world. One of them is by Bernard Lewis called What Went Wrong, and I haven't opened it, but it's just like, this is why the Islamic world declined and the Western world like ascended to greatness. And like I just like read the table of contents. I'm like, this is like total Westoid like cope. Like this is just like trash. I know some people really like as like a Western account of like Islamic history. Some people really like Tom Holland. I know that's like not like the actor.
Not the actor.
Tom Holland is a historian, and he. I think it's like the Rise of the Sword or whatever, and it's about like Islam's beginnings. It was a bit of a controversial book, I think, but I think the one thing that gives me lend more credence to it is an author who I do enjoy, Nicholas Taleb, who was a Levant Christian from Lebanon. So obviously Christian, there might still be, given the history of Lebanon, there might still be some antipathy between the two, but he really recommended Tom Holland as like an Islamic historian. So that gives me a little more credit because at least he's from the area, But I feel like, this like Lawrence is probably like the greatest like way to make inways to it, because otherwise it's almost like it's very difficult for us to wrap our heads around, you know.
And especially like the Arab world, right?
Yeah.
One of the things about Sykes-Picot was it put national boundaries where there had never been national boundaries before, right? That's super, super important. I think, and I definitely think that Lawrence is a great way to sort of introduce yourself to the beginnings of what we would call the modern Arabic world. The Arabic world after the Arab Revolt, after World War I, became a sort of, and this happened gradually because there was different leaderships and all of that. It became a highly nationalized area. Syria, Iraq, Iran, or Iran wasn't really involved in this. I should say, I should note that was not involved in this. But like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, all of the Lebanon, all these places were created by the Western interference here, and they had never been divided that way before. And actually, this is sort of a side note, I should say, but there was a time later on, or 50s, 60s, 70s, when the Arab world was there was really strong feeling that it should unite into a single bloc. And it's interesting because the people there were for it, but there was not the governments had no incentive to do so, and there was no movement on it. So if that had been different, if like the Sykes-Picot had worked out differently, if the British promises had worked out differently, we could well have seen an Arabic bloc or like a pan-Arab state. But the way that history worked out, it just didn't come to fruition, even though there was feeling for it. There was very strong feeling for it. Yeah, you're right. Well, there was people like Muammar Gaddafi who died quite recently, actually, during the Arab Revolt. Some of our listeners might be a little young to sort of remember that, but it did happen, 11 years ago, 2011, I think it was. The people like that, like Muammar Gaddafi, was very much into Arabism. He was very keen on that, and there was other people who were very, very involved in those sort of directions. But just didn't work out. Just didn't work out. So definitely, Lawrence of Arabia is a good start. And then if you continue having interest, definitely read about it, be informed, and learn, because that's what we're here for. We're very much. Hopefully, this will inspire you to take more interest in that part of the world, because it is very fascinating.
Anything else?
I think that's a good closing statement. Honestly, definitely check out the book, read up, inform yourselves, and thanks for listening.
And this has been Science of History on the Arab Revolt in Lawrence of Arabia. It is. What day? The 21st. It is the 21st of January, 2023. I hope you have a great weekend, and you are listening to WMTU 91.9 FM Houghton.